An important consideration in this second unit is how can people who study the Bible live a life that is truly based on the Bible, what we might say a Bible-based faith. We're going to look at it from different angles and different aspects of life. Okay, the first of these, which is the most obvious, is the Bible and family. How can the Bible impact the way our families live? Well, first of all, the Bible gives us a model for family. In the creation, God created Adam and Eve to raise a family, to raise a race of human beings. In the Torah, we have many instructions about family life, particularly in a passage called the Shema. The family is the place where children are taught about God, where children are taught the meaning of life. Solomon says that a family is not really a family unless God is the builder of that family. Somehow it seems important in the minds of Bible writers that God is very much involved in family. Otherwise, it is not a Bible-based family life. The New Testament gives us instructions about how parents should treat the children, how children should relate towards their parents, how the family must be held together, the way the church is held together, and that is by the presence of God. Not that God tells us every single minute what to do, what not to do. He allows families to have their uniqueness, their potentials. But the basic model is this, that a family is humans, parents, children, connected to one source of life, and that is God. And when God is involved, when God is building, then the family is truly Bible-based. So in the words of Solomon in Psalm 127, unless God builds the home, those who try to build one will not be successful. Is it possible that so many of the family problems and the family breakdown that we are seeing in the contemporary world is coming about as a result of our walking away from this model and trying to create our own version of family instead of following a Bible-based pattern? Something to think about. Having a Bible-based faith means that we must also look at how the Bible informs marriage. One of the most common, the most human institution of all. We get married. People get married. This has been there for as long as humans have been there. It's almost like an automatic reflex action among humans. I'm going to get married someday. Well, God created marriage. He made a man and a woman and he put them together and they became husband and wife. Adam says, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She is woman, I am man, and we are one. The Bible says that the two become one flesh in the whole creation story. And we have stories in the Bible that impact this concept of marriage. There is that love at first sight story between Isaac and Rebekah. There's another one between Boaz and Ruth. We have an entire book, an entire song called the Song of Songs, which describes the journey of love in male-female relationship, in marriage, that begins with, he is mine, that ends up with, say, love is the fire of God, it's the flame of God. We have the example of Prophet Isaiah, who called his wife prophetess. Is it because she was also a prophet, or simply because she was his wife, or a term of endearment? It seemed that she participated in his work. So it's not just about companionship, it's something a lot more than that. And then in the New Testament, we discover that for love to be really true, and this must apply even more to marriage, is that it cannot be benefits-based. A lot of people get married for the benefit it brings them. The Bible proposes a different concept, love beyond. In the modern world, marriage is seen as a 50-50% agreement. But the Bible sees love as a 100-0 agreement, that you make a complete crossover so that you are in your partner's shoes and your partner is in your shoes. Complete sacrifice, love beyond your feelings, beyond your needs, beyond your thoughts, beyond your culture, beyond what you have learned, and everything else. And perhaps when we do that, then maybe the marriages that we see around us will be a whole lot stronger. And hopefully you can apply this to your life someday when you do get married. What about the Bible and other human relationships that we have? We have to relate to people at work, to people in school. We have to relate to people in the community, the neighbors, and all of these relationships. And then, of course, the immediate ones, the family, the relatives. What does the Bible have to say about all those? Well, one principle in the Bible is that holiness must be always in action. In other words, as pure, as clean as we can. The Bible also teaches in the Sermon on the Mount of Jesus some relational attitudes. Poor in spirit, humble, peaceful, the ability to feel and empathize, the ability to put God first, that these are attitudes that help us in our relationship. Another principle we find in Jesus is to learn to look evil in the eye. The human way, which we discover in some Old Testament texts, is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, revenge or vengeance is the mode. Jesus says, if they hit you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. He's not saying that you allow yourself to be victimized. No, he's saying that you must develop the courage to look evil in the eye and say, okay, you're doing bad to me, but I will not return in kind to you. Jesus tells us stories about sheep and goats. And the sheep are accepted by God because they live their lives in service to humanity. The goats were rejected by God because they live their lives in selfishness. You live in a world of selfies. And the 21st century is extremely selfish century. That people don't really care too much about the world around them, only about themselves. Most people today are glued into their mobile phone. They don't even see the people around them, let alone to really be human-oriented. There are those who care a lot about the environment, but not a lot of people care a lot about other people. This is like the young Timothy asked by Paul to carry a heavy burden of the church. And that is really what the Bible is all about, that human relationships is about helping other people to bear their burdens. It's not about what I can get. It's about what I can give, what I can share. And now my students who like to copy each other's classwork will say this, sharing is caring. No, that's the wrong kind of sharing. We're talking the sharing that is sacrificial, the sharing that puts the needs of other people above my own needs. This is the Bible principle of relationship, different attitude and a different lifestyle. We live in a world that is highly secular. There's a weaker sense of the religious in this century than maybe any other century. And so we must ask the question, how can the Bible impact such a world, such a secular world? You may be surprised that the Bible is a major source of research. In Europe, most big universities have a department that studies the Bible. There are lots of people who are called biblical experts who are not believers. Okay, it's a great book for academic research. So the Bible is very much into the world of academia and research. We have these supersized churches called mega churches who are organized in a very secular models, not really following the models of the Bible. Contemporary counseling has crept into the church, and we often have this thing called Christian counseling, which is really using secular models, but then you tag the name Christian on top of it. Medicine wrestles with ethical questions that are religious in nature. Is it right for a doctor to administer medicine for a really suffering patient who wants to die? What we call euthanasia. And so increasingly we find this dichotomy of life. People in the secular world making religious decisions but not becoming religious or accepting the Bible. And people in the world of the Bible are drawing away. I heard recently of a group of Christians here in Bangkok who decided that they will not take the COVID vaccine because the vaccine is the mark of the beast. Now that is really applying the Bible in such a strange manner, in a way that the Bible cannot understand itself that way. And yet we have these extreme movements. And so in our very secular world, things are becoming very extreme as well. Religion is becoming extreme, science becoming extreme, militaries are becoming extreme. Extremism has become a way of life. So racism has become very extreme too. Cultural pride has become very extreme as well. And can the Bible impact all of this? I would like to suggest that it can. If people are willing objectively to approach and discover the values of the Bible, it can help them even in this very dichotomized secular world. I hope that you will take that approach to your personal life. In this lesson, we will consider kind of a follow-up question to the previous one. If we are living in this highly dichotomized, secularized world, then is faith still possible? What are the challenges to having faith? When everybody around you believes in the Big Bang Theory, can you still maintain belief in creation story, in the Bible story? Or, as is happening more and more in so many religions and even in some Christian circles, is faith something that we reserve only for that holy place? So when I go to the temple or to the church or to the mosque or the synagogue, that's when I talk about faith, that's when I exercise faith, but the moment I exit that, it's some other paradigms of life. So for people who keep Shabbat, faith on Shabbat, but 6 days of the week, it's something else. For people who go to church on Sunday, exercise faith on Sunday, but the rest of the week, it is something else. That is the real big question for us to consider. I would like to suggest that for faith to be real in today's world, it must be real at the workplace. It must be real in the marketplace. It must be real in the city streets. What this means is that the way you are at home, the way you are in church, must be the same way you are everywhere. Otherwise, faith becomes just a religious practice reserved for certain moments of time. But for faith to function this way everywhere, it must be rational enough. It must be a thought-based faith, not the old English expression of blind faith. Why do you believe this? Well, because my church says so. Why do you believe this? Well, because my teacher says so. Most people believe in the Big Bang Theory because that's what they have heard in the classroom in every science class. They have never actually examined it themselves and figure out, is it a viable concept? Many Christians claim they believe in the creation story, but for exactly the same reason. They heard it in Sunday school or in Sabbath school or in church school or in Bible classes. Never really examine the concepts for themselves. You have to think through your faith. I would like to suggest that the only kind of faith that can survive in our highly dichotomized, secularized world is a rational faith, a faith that is based on thought. And it can take the biblical data and apply it properly to the questions of life that are appropriate for this moment, for this point in time. And when that happens, that faith will stand up. That faith will support you. A big question for us to consider now is, do we have examples, stories, people in the Bible who figured out how to balance those two things, the needs of life and the world around them that was different with their belief, with their faith, with their relationship with God? Well, I'd like to propose a few examples. Abraham, he was called by God to be the father of a nation of faith, but he had to live among peoples who had other gods, who believed other things, who whose lifestyle, whose attitudes, whose values were different from his. But he found a way. He maintained his faith, but he also adapted to the neighbors around him, and so he succeeded. There was Joseph, who was sold as a slave to Egypt and then becomes a prime minister of Egypt. He figured out how to balance his faith in God with the requirements of working for government or even as a slave in a foreign land. And so he was able to maintain his faith. A really great example is Daniel, taken as a young captive by the Babylonians to Babylon and quickly inducted into the service of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and rose to second in command of the kingdom. There were many tests and trials, and the Bible gives us the tests and the trials that he did. He adjusted. He thought his way through. He applied what he could in a manner that enabled him to keep praying 3 times a day publicly so people knew he was doing it, and yet serving faithfully in the government and being completely above corruption because of his faith. When they tried to trip him up, they found that his religion is the only way to trip him up, because in terms of cleanness of government and incorruptibility, Daniel was untouchable. And so he demonstrated that you can be in politics, you can be at the top of the country in terms of government and still stay with your hands clean because of your faith in God. We have a young lady who became queen in Persia, Esther, who also figured out how to walk the demands of being the queen, the demands of her Jewish faith. She kept both, and she saved a lot of people. She saved the entire Jewish people in that. In the New Testament, we can think of Paul, who was called to be apostle to the Gentiles. He had a faith, but everywhere he went, people had other faiths. He had to contend with those faiths. He had to convince people to accept Jesus. He found a way to work between the lines. He made a statement that is very powerful in this. To the Greeks, I am like a Greek. To the Romans, I am like a Roman, so that I can convince some. Paul learned to be completely contextualized. His faith worked in the real world. If your faith works only in some artificial religious world, then you need to examine if your faith is real. Real faith operates in the real world that you live in. Contextualization was suggested by Paul as a way of living in the world. And it's become a major word in today's world, in business, in education, and of course in religion. A good example is McDonald's. The burgers that they sell in America and the burgers that they sell in Malaysia and the burgers that they sell in India are very, very different from each other. You see, in India, they need a spicy burger. Americans can't eat spicy. And in Malaysia, they can never use pork in any shape or form. And so you have a different kind of product as well. And also sizes. In Asia, when you buy French fries in McDonald's and you say large, it's about that big. In America, if you say large, it's about that big. Different. This is what we call contextualization, adapting a product to the context, but at the same time, changing that product itself. The gospel, the message of Jesus, has to be contextualized. Jesus may be the bread of life, but in Asia, he becomes the rice of life. But it's a two-way street, because the gospel brings ideas that transforms the culture, but itself, it has to adapt to the culture. So the gospel and the way of doing the gospel is changing, but it is also changing the world into which it comes. So 2 aspects, transformation and adaptation at the same time. Another good example in our world today is the mobile phone system. You have Galaxy, you have iPhone, those are the 2 big companies right now. They're basically doing the same things, but they come at it from a different approach, different operating system, and a different way of dealing with apps and stuff. And yet, you do the same thing. You make phones, you text, you take pictures. They have been contextualized to fit different tastes and different people. In some ways, you have to think of God as being Asian if you live in Asia, as many of us do. 3 out of every 5 people in the world is technically belonging to the continent of Asia. So God is really Asian. If you think of God as a European, a Westerner, then you have a different response to him. If you think of God as Asian, you have a different response to him. And at the end of the day, the point is, when we learn to do that, to contextualize, then we can make our faith real. So people can look at us and say, oh, you're a Christian. And no, we're still Asian. And not say, oh, you're a Christian, so you're Western. That cannot happen. And when we make Jesus real in our lives, when we make the Bible real in our lives, and we do it in a contextual way, then God is the one who receives all the glory. This lesson is similar to the previous one, but it focuses more on how to make the gospel real. Well, first of all, we must understand what gospel means. The word gospel, literally translated from Greek, simply means good news. But in the New Testament, it's the good news about Jesus. And so making the gospel real is really about making Jesus real. Whatever you do, how it works today is definitely different from how it worked last century. The approach has to be practical enough that anybody can learn to do it. It's kind of like teaching somebody how to drive or how to ride a bicycle. We have to introduce people in a way that's real so that people can know that when I become a Christian, I can still eat rice. I don't have to change to bread. We're not talking about food. We're talking about cultural change. So that Jesus becomes real with you, becomes real with other people. A little story. Some missionaries were shipwrecked in the South Pacific, and one of those missionaries was rescued by a local group of fishermen in a small little island, and he lived with them, helped them. He built a little hut for himself. He did not do much teaching or much saying of anything. He just helped people wherever he could. 20 years later, another group of missionaries came and landed on that island, and they set up some meeting and they began to tell stories about Jesus. And the islanders said, wait a minute, we know this Jesus, he lives among us. And the missionaries were shocked. They're like, what? Jesus lived 2,000 years ago? No, he lives among us. All the stories you're telling, that's what he does. And so can you take us? They asked, can you show us this man? They took him there, and sure enough, it was this lost missionary. The mission boat that had sent him thought he had been lost in that shipwreck. But he'd been living there and living among them in such a real way that Jesus became real, and they knew Jesus through him without knowing Jesus. Sounds like a strange fact, but it's real. So people will know about God through us. We are the eyes, we are the mouthpieces, we are the ears, we are the hands, we are the feet. And how we live, we are making Jesus real. We are making the gospel real. I hope that you will do that.